Yeah, very excited to have you here, Sandra. Yeah, I met Sandra at a customer experience conference in Canada last month, and yeah, it was a great experience. Just chatting about customer success and all things customer experience. And so I'm really excited to have you here chatting about the topic, change leadership through the lens of customer conversations. And yeah, you've had a lot of experience in the space working at some of the leading companies, Sandra, LinkedIn, DocuSign, and I think you can bring really great perspectives to these conversations. But before we dive in, why customer success? How did you end up in DS and what has kept you in it?
It's a good question. So I originally went to school. I have a master's in interior architecture, and I originally wanted to be an interior designer. And I was spending a lot of time on the computer doing things like 3D modeling and Revit. And then I had this epiphany. I could spend just as much time on the computer, but double my salary if I go into tech.
Okay.
And so then I started going into startup fairs and events. I learned how to code, really basic like programming languages. And then I ended up meeting the co-founder of a company called Open Asset at a startup fair in New York.
Okay.
And it's a software company that develops software for architects and engineers. And I started working there. I knew about the industry, and I was able to I knew about like the kind of customers that they serve. And in that time, I had different roles like account manager, project manager. Customer success was not a widely known thing at the time.
Mm.
And a few years into that role, we realized that what our work was becoming, what it was known in the outside world, was customer success. So we started going to customer success events, and we renamed the department and we became customer success managers. So that was my first kind of role, working at a software company and working in customer success. But I didn't know that that's sort of what it would end up being like. And then through the course of the last 10 years or so, I've stayed in customer success. I've worked at larger companies, like you mentioned, LinkedIn and DocuSign. I've worked at smaller companies. And I guess the thing that keeps me is that, one, technology is always changing. So there's something interesting in that. You can always be learning something new. And then as it relates to the customers, it almost feels like you're helping them. Sometimes you're helping them in very small ways, but other times you're helping them in really big ways, because how well they use your product could determine how good they are at their job, and what does that mean for their career, their family life, etc. So sometimes it feels like you're really just helping people.
Mm. No, it's a great point. Like customer success is really about service and helping other people be successful. So it can many times feel like a mission, right? And a calling. So very excited for you on this path. Now, what does change leadership mean to you? Like you've done a number of projects in this area, but how do you define change leadership at work?
Change leadership to me encompasses a lot of different things, including just formal change management. I do have a project management background. I decided to go back and sort of learn about project management and become certified as a PMP. So in addition to like the methodology of like how do you bring change in an organization, I think there's also something to do with human psychology, understanding what motivates people, what makes them want to change, or what are the things that they need to do to change if they don't necessarily want that change initially. So I think there's change management, I think there's human psychology, and I think the leadership for me, and this is not always the case, but for me, it's modeling good behavior. If I tell people that, let's say, we should be adopting a piece of software or a new way of doing things, I have had to be willing to do that myself and talk about the success I've had in doing it. So for instance, at my company recently, we've been deploying a Copilot, and my company is in a highly regulated industry, and they're doing so in a very gentle manner, trying to be very considerate of safety, security, privacy. And so Copilot was just an internal kind of deployment to understand, like, how do we use it? How can we use it to better understand in the future, how could customers use it? And so I'm in one of the earlier groups that has Copilot at my company. And that means I have to be willing to use it. I have to try things. I have to have figure out my own learning curve with it. And that's the only way that I will then in the future be able to get anyone on my team to be able to use it, is if they see that I'm using it and it's enough value that I would spend my own time using it. And that's why I'm recommending it for them as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great example of, showing leadership in serving other people, in the workplace. How have you leveraged, customer conversations to really drive this kind of change, especially with like senior leadership, right? How have you gone about that kind of
That's a
change?
very timely question, because we just wrapped up our Voice of the Customer program for this year for 2 of our products. And it's very easy for me to take customer feedback and conversations and make sort of data points out of them, show the trends and patterns, and go back to senior leadership and say, this many customers have said the same thing about this issue or this area for improvement. So I would say that when you're very close to the customer, you have the ability to use those conversations, firsthand knowledge of what people in the field want, and be able to make a very persuasive argument or business case for why change should happen within your organization.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have had similar experiences where just having that customer feedback, the first line of sight to what customers need or their pain points, feels like a superpower in the business. Like you can you can really dictate or at least influence the direction that certain conversations go in. Now, what do you think as you bring in this feedback from customers and share them with leaders? What do you think leaders are not sharing in the conversations that you think they absolutely should be paying attention to?
What I think sometimes, let's say, leaders or even other cross-functional teams don't hear is maybe the urgency, the business case, the justification for why someone would want, let's say, a feature or a bug fix. I think oftentimes when we hear from customers, it can sound like a complaint, or there can be a lot of emotion behind it. But if we dig deeper and we ask them, why is this important to you? And they tell us, well, this impacts our ability to sell more or maybe to cut costs, and you can put a number to that. You marry that with other customers who have the same feedback, and you start to put together, let's say, a ballpark number of how much it costs or how much it could help with revenue. That is very compelling. That is taking the emotion out of it and making it very business oriented and saying, this has this much money tied to it. Is that worth a conversation? And most people, depending on how big the number is, will say, yes, it's worth us hearing this out.
Right, right. So is it the numbers from how much this customer is worth to our business, or from how much is the problem worth to their business?
It's all those things, and it's even opportunity of how much could this generate in the future if we were to resolve this. So for instance, at my organization, we get feedback sometimes that the onboarding process is too long. And some customers have said in things like voice of the customer interviews that we've done, that if, let's say, the onboarding time were reduced, they'd be able to bring on more of business because they would be able to cut down the cycle time. And so it's not even, we're not losing money, but we're not making that money that the customer has identified as potential because of the time it takes us to onboard. And so that is just as important as all the other things.
So what I hear you say is you need to find a way to translate that customer need, that pain point, to business value to really drive the kind of influence.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you talked about emotions, right? Capturing the emotions in the customer's voice, in their need, the urgency. How do you make sure that that emotion, the nuance and the intent behind the feedback doesn't get lost in translation? How do you build systems that capture not just the data, but all of these other nuances and emotions?
That's a really good question. So we do this in a number of different ways. One, when we have, let's say, recurring calls like a quarterly business review, we just kind of open the floor and ask the customer if they have any questions. Or even in preparing for a meeting like that, we may say, what are the top things that you want to talk about or that are most pressing for you? Sometimes you'd be surprised. There are things that you did not know were a problem or an issue to discuss, and they're bringing it to the forefront. So giving them an opportunity to tell you, make sure you're confirming and not assuming that you understand like what's important to them, is a key part of that. And then in terms of like using those recurring calls, it's also asking people in the field who are customer facing, what's the sentiment that you think is with that customer? So if you email them, how quickly do they respond, or do they respond? For billing, do they pay their bills on time? If they don't pay their bills on time, let's say they're months overdue, how valuable could your product be to them when they could be at risk of it shutting off, or you shutting them down? So I would say that there are a lot of indicators that maybe are not product analytics, but are just kind of sentiment from people who are customer facing, but also the behavior that the customer may be displaying, or people may be displaying, to show you how much of a priority your product or service is to them, is also kind of part of that equation.
That's a great point. Do you find ways to translate or communicate that emotion to leadership or to teams? That, it feels like within documents and text and some of the regular channels for communication, you might not be able to pass on that pain and urgency in the customer's voice. How do you think about that?
That's true. So we have a number of different initiatives internally. They're not OKRs, but we have this key initiatives where we come up with a list of things at the start of the year that we say are important. And as we work through those, it's also figuring out how do we prioritize the things that we think are important. And part of what I do is thinking through the lens of the customer, understanding their pain points, what they're saying is important to them. And then it becomes my responsibility in the work we're doing to make sure that I'm communicating the urgency, I'm communicating the importance of things, and how then it should impact what we prioritize. So in some ways, I'm kind of like the mediator. I'm listening, trying to listen to the customers as best I can, trying to listen to like the people in the field. And I'm, as our chief customer officer has said, we're the voice of the customer and we're the voice of the business. We have a unique way of being at the intersection of all these different teams. And so we can really balance that, the need to listen to customers, the need to run a business, and then make sort of an intelligent risk about what we think is the most important thing to focus on.
You talk about assumptions, like in one of your responses, you talked about like, making assumptions while engaging with customers. But what is the difference between, getting the customer feedback to validate assumptions, or listening to actually transform a process or a product? Feels like many times as teams, product teams especially, just trying to like hear what we want to hear in the customer conversation, right? So how do we make sure that we're not just validating, assumptions, hearing what we want to hear in the data, but we're actually using that feedback, the conversations, and the insights to drive or transform our products and processes?
So a number of different ways. One is we have our product team join some of our calls, and the product team has calls with customers so they can hear firsthand some of the things that customers have to say and their feedback, because it could be maybe I'm communicating the information through my lens, my own bias, and it maybe is more impactful for someone, let's say like a product team or a sales team, to hear directly from the customer, or I would say a product team, maybe a support team. So there's that element of giving them an opportunity to hear firsthand from customers. Second, as someone who is customer facing, being able to articulate why something is important to the customer through like the things that we talked about. One, a sense of urgency, the business case. How common is this request across our customer base? Does it affect a lot of our customers? Because then I would say then it seems like it should be prioritized. And if you ask people, like, do you think if this affects at least half of the customers that it's important? Most people are not going to say no. If it affects the majority of customers, I still don't think it's important. That's not an answer that you would likely to get. And I guess the third would be in terms of working with the product team. Maybe something we've gone through in the past, especially I mentioned our Voice of the Customer program, is showing the trend year over year. So both the good and the bad. So if, let's say, we had a major overhaul of our UI saying, that actually went really well. The customer said that it's been a good experience so far, that they really like the improvement. And then also sharing what's challenging. If we just give, let's say, our team members just bad news or things that they need to work on all the time, and we don't celebrate the things that are going well, or places where there's progress or like noticeable areas that have been improved, then that could make what we have to say lack nuance, no balance, no context. And so we have to give visibility to both the good and the bad.
Yeah, that's a strong point. That's a strong point you make about balancing the narrative across, what's positive and what can be improved.